Hello guys, welcome to this video that I'm going to explain to you some mindset that you should have while developing communication between microservices. I'm going to explain Outbox Pattern that in my personal opinion is a must that we need to consider in communication between services. So at the beginning of this presentation I want to show you a little bit about a common mistake I see when design or develop a software architecture. It's a really common mistake that isn't easy to find out, that probably generates some inconsistent problems now the data. So then I will explain how this common mistake is developed and what are their consequences to the data that is dispatched between services. After that, I will mention what are the main problems of this approach and why we should avoid this mindset. Finally, I want to explain you about Outbox Pattern. It's a good mindset that maybe you should think about it in order to maintain a healthy software with data consistent. So before we continue, I want to explain that exist a lot of different ways of developing this pattern, such as implementation and also different technologies. In this case, in this specific presentation, I'm going to be technology agnostic, so what I'm going to explain can be implemented in whatever language you choose. However, I will write in the description below a GitHub link with a Spring Show implementation. So you can see a little example of how this pattern can be implemented. So maybe this design I kinda exaggerate about it, but however I want to transmit that we should be careful when we plan an architecture. So if you see this flow, the flow isn't the problem. The data that is shipped between the service isn't the problem. The problem here is while we try to send the information to a service and also store that information in a database. This can be kind of tricky. So, which is the usual approach here that I saw in many cases? In this scenario, a user sends a request to a service A. Then, service A posts a message after processing the information to a queue. In the meantime, that a service B, a listener, consumes that piece of data from the queue, service A tries to store that information in their own database and responds to the caller that all happens okay, a successful message. And then service B proceeds to store the information read from the queue to their own database. This service B maybe can process after or before service A stores in the database, can be in the meantime, while, or after or before. That isn't important in the presentation, but can happen. Okay. So, what is the main issue here? What is the issue in the flow that I presented before? Why the data can become inconsistently between services while we apply the communication steps I showed. So, let's imagine in this scenario that the caller also sends a message to a service A. Then service A processes that information and posts a message to a queue. After service A tries to store that information to the database, an error happens. And service A throws an exception and the caller receives an error. But The problem here is that the queue already have that information, that data, and service B can process that information successfully and store in their own database. So, what is the problem here? Service A process with an error and information isn't in their database, but service B have the information and stores that information in their own database. And the caller did receive an error. So the information is in part of the system and in the other part of the system isn't it. So why happened this? Because posting in a queue and also storing in a database happens in the same transaction. First one and after that the second. That is the main issue here, that for the consistent data. So what is the solution here is to apply Outbox Pattern. So imagine that the same scenario, a caller sends a request to the service A, and service A, before sending information or doing something with information, the own service process that information and stores in their own database and responds to the caller that the operation happens successfully. This in one transaction. In other transaction exists a message relayer, that is another service, that picks up that information from the database and sends to the queue in order to service B process that message. And after that, service B stores that information in their own database, and all happen in another transaction that is not the transaction that store the data in the database in service A. So in this case, if an error happens while processing the information in service A, we have no risk that service B process the information, because the first step in order to a successful operation is just the first, and the only step is a transactional operation that happens between service A and their own database in just one transaction. After that, after the information became stored in an Outbox table in the database, a message relayer picks up that information and drops it in the queue. So we split the same transaction that I explained in the slide before in two different transactions. That is the Outbox pattern, and that's why this is a really good pattern to apply in order to maintain consistent data between microservices. So I want to say thank you very much. Also, I want to say you that all architecture patterns have some drawbacks. In this case, a drawback is that it's more difficult to implement, have many steps than, for example, if you want to implement in the same transaction posting in a queue and also storing a database. But the advantage is that you can maintain the data in a consistent way. So thank you very much. See you in the next video, and please subscribe and put some likes in my video. Bye bye.